Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Johnson, and this is the Perpetual Chess Podcast. On Perpetual Chess, I have weekly conversations with the chess world's best players, promoters, and educators about their lives, careers, current projects, and best practices. Perpetual Chess is brought to you through the generosity of its Patreon and PayPal supporters. For more information, go to perpetualchesspod.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perpetual Chess. So we have an extra special guest today, an esteemed author, a Grandmaster, former top 100 player in the world, author of two of the most venerable chess columns in the world, including Chess to Enjoy and Chess Life magazine, but most of all, writer of countless books. If I listed all the books that GM Soltis has written, it would be its own podcast. So let's just say many, many books. I'm sure many listeners have read them. Most recently, he wrote 365 Chess Master Lessons, Take One Day at a Time to Become a Better Chess Player. And as we will discuss, coming out in the new year, he has a multi-biography called Petrosian, Spassky and Korchnoi, a chess multi-biography with 206 games. And it is my great honor to introduce Grandmaster Andy Soltis. Mr. Soltis, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Ben. I'm happy to be here.
So as I mentioned to you in an email before we were recording, I had winning with 1e4 when I was a teenager, and I actually won some games with 1e4 thanks to that book. So I want to thank you for that, first off.
Oh, well, thank you. I stopped doing those books for Ken Smith's Chess Digest many, many years ago, but people still remember them fondly, and some of them people don't like the books at all, but, they kept me busy for a while.
Yeah, and with so many books on your belt, and you're someone who you write biographies, you write sort of historical tomes, and you also write practical books ranging from middle game advice or books about pawn structures to books about openings. So when you finish one book and it's time to start the next one, how do you decide what to write about?
Well, I usually try to think 2 moves ahead. So when I'm researching a book, I'm also researching another book. Probably the worst feeling I ever have is when I don't have a project to work on. So, for example, now I'm thinking about another historical book that I'll probably work on next year. I'm working on a practical book. I don't want to give you the details because, it hasn't. Still in the early stages, but it's I keep a list of possible projects, and I let it germinate or marinate, or as my friend John Fedorovich would say, fester, and eventually, when I have some free time, I start working on it.
Okay, and in terms of free time, are you spending all of your time? I mean, between your columns and your books, I imagine that keeps you pretty busy. Do you do teaching as well, or what else keeps you busy?
No, I have never given a chess lesson.
And you've never gotten one either, right?
No, I never gotten one. I do teach my wife Marcy. We look at chess every so often, but I've never been into teaching. I remember Bruce Pandolfini many years ago would call me up every so often and say, "I got a great student for you," and I'd explain, "Bruce, go away." I think the last time was when I said I did not want to teach Josh Waitzkin.
That's funny. I guess he knew not to call you after that.
Yeah, I think we've come to an accommodation of that. But no, I don't do anything about chess, but write. And since I retired, in fact, Marcy and I retired on the same day 4.5 years ago. We've done a lot of traveling, so that takes up a lot of time. So I keep busy.
Good for you. And what did you retire from?
I was a reporter and rewrite man, sometimes editor at the New York Post, basically since the fall of 1969, and we went through some stormy times in the newspaper business. And right now, I'm sort of happy that I'm no longer doing the type of work I used to do. But it was fun times when it lasted.
Good, yeah, and I'm glad that you were able to leave on your own terms. As you allude to, in the newspaper business, not everyone has been able to do that in the past decade.
Right, of course. Yeah.
So where do you do any chess-related travel, or is it more just tourism?
Oh, no, it's just tourism. I mean, I used to, when I was much younger, I used to go on the student team tournaments, and I got to places like Prague and Dresden, Haifa, and at that time I had not played chess in like Chicago or San Francisco or anything like that. I eventually got caught up with that in playing in foreign tournaments and any U.S. tournaments. But nowadays, I'm just purely a tourist, and we've done some fun things since we retired. Marcy and I rode an elephant in Bali, and we walked under the falls at Niagara. We took the night tour at Alcatraz, and we explored the zoo at nighttime in Singapore. We've done a lot of fun things.
This is not Koltanowski's night tour, but the night tour of the prison, right?
Yes, that's sort of a different thing. And then we some of our we love to cruise, and we've been on cruises to some places that are basically prison islands, Devil's Island, for example, or South Andaman Island in the Indian Ocean. So we've got to some really obscure places. And being sort of a true New Yorker, I've never learned how to drive a car, so getting around sometimes is hard. So we have to rely on cruise ships and other things, other modes of transportation.
Yeah, well, in the age of Uber, if you guys have figured out that app, things have gotten a little easier.
And the only time we ever took Uber was in Shanghai, believe it or not. So we're sort of 20th century people trying to make do in the 21st century.
Okay. Well, do you have any trips planned for the rest of the year, or are you just hunkering down with your writing right now?
Oh, no, we're going to be in Spain sometime late in the year. We're going to go on a cruise to China and Japan coming up. We just came back from San Francisco. We go to San Francisco every summer because it is at least 15 degrees cooler there than it is in New York, where we live. So, yeah. And it never got up to 70 while we were there in the beginning of August. So that's perfect for us.
Yeah, I love New York, but the summers can be long.
Yes.
So you came out with 365 chess master lessons recently, and is your multi-biography of Tal, Petrosian, Spassky, and Korchnoi, is that all done? Is that all done?
It's all done. I'm waiting to look at the proofs, and that it's a slow process sometimes when you get to these massive books published by McFarland. Robbie Franklin, who is the founder of McFarland, is also a chess buff, and he. I've been working with him since almost the beginning. I think the first McFarland book that I worked on with a guy named Gene McCormick, that came out around 1980. And Robbie's been a great help throughout all this time, and we're working on that, and maybe we'll do something in the future.
And with this many books under your belt, if you come up with an idea, like once you do know what you want to write about next, if you take it to McFarland, do they still say no sometimes, or are you pretty much within the chess dome?
I've been astonishingly lucky with publishers over the years. Very rarely do they say no. In fact, I never really had much difficulty finding a publisher. Usually they come to me. I'll give you an example. When I graduated from college, it was early 1969, and I had been very busy the previous 4 years. My main priority, I guess, was working on a college newspaper. My second priority was keeping my grades up, because if I didn't, I might get drafted and be sent to Vietnam.
That's good motivation.
Third priority, let's see. I was working as a copy boy one night a week at the New York Post, working a midnight shift. And chess was the fourth priority. It actually took up the least of my time. But all of a sudden, again, in February of '69, I'm out of college, so I really don't have that much to do. So I thought, well, there's going to be a World Championship match coming up, and this time I think Spassky is going to beat Petrosian. So I thought, okay, how about if I start working on a book of Spassky's games, because there weren't any at that time. And as luck would have it, I mentioned that I was doing this. I mentioned it to Ed Edmondson, who was the executive director of the USCF. And Ed was always looking for a new revenue stream for the Federation. And he said, okay, well, how about if we publish it? And you guys don't publish anything. They said, no, that's not a problem. You just type it up. We'll photo offset it. This is a process that's long forgotten. But they would photo offset it, put a binding around it, and sell it for free, or not for free, for a couple dollars. And that's what happened. That was my first book, and eventually Ed got me in touch with a company called David McKay, which at that time was about the only publisher of chess books in the United States. And they decided to do their own version of that Spassky book, and after that I was sort of off and running. I did pawn structure chess for McKay and a couple of other books at that time, and one thing led to another.
So you showed good foresight writing about Spassky in advance of the match.
Yeah, I also did a book of Korchnoi's games that never got published. So you win some and you lose some. The only problem I ever had with published.
What happened with that?
Nobody was interested. I couldn't find a market for it. Korchnoi wasn't Korchnoi then. He was sort of an unknown player. The only problems I ever really had with publishers is over the titles of books, because they sort of jealously guard their control over the titles, and they think that if they get a very general audience to buy it, even a non-chess audience, they'll get, which is sort of crazy. I remember, in fact, they published a book called Sacrifices in the Sicilian, which was by my old friend David Levy, and it was about the Sicilian defense, and, like can you sacrifice a piece on b5 or on f5. And McKay published it, I think, partly because they thought it was a spy novel.
Right.
Sacrifices, and it sounded like something by Helen McGinnis.
Yeah.
But I had that problem, too. I wanted to call a book Everything You Wanted to Know About the Endgame, but the Grandmasters Won't Tell You. And my publisher just said, it was Bob Long, he said, no, that's not going to work. So it came out as something like Endgame Secrets, Grandmaster Secrets Endgames. Another time I wanted to do a book for Random House, and I wanted to call it How to Win a One Endgame, or How to Win a One Game, which is an expression that chess players use. They know that the hardest game to win, the hardest positions to win, are the ones that are already won, technically. And you have to go through the winning technique, which is difficult to learn, and there weren't very many books on the subject. Now, publisher hated the book, hated that title, because what does it mean? How to win a one game? That doesn't make any sense. So that it came out as Turning Advantage into Victory in Chess, which is about as dull as you can imagine.
Right. Yeah, they seem to always try to take the thread of what you're saying, but then they kind of turn it into non-chessic terms, which, as you alluded to, I mean, good luck recruiting the non-chess player to read a book about how to win a chess game.
Yeah.
But in any event, your books do seem to find an audience, so...
Yeah, that's, I've been sort of lucky like that. I mean, I don't have, my books don't sell, 80,000 copies. I'm not going to, the best-selling books, as far as I know on chess, are written by James Eade and Patrick Wolf, and that's Chess for Dummies, and I forget the name of the Wolf book. I think it was Chess for Complete Idiots, something like that. Those are enormous bestsellers. My books, they do well. They stay in print. Pawn Structure Chess has been in print now for more than 40 years, which is, pretty good. Frankly, I'll tell you, the reason I did that book, 365 Chess Master Lessons, was because about 3 years ago, I was thinking about doing a column for Chess Life about Irving Chernev. This is the column that only appeared in August of 2018. But when I started thinking about it, I was wondering, why do Chernev's books remain in print all these years, whereas Fred Reinfeld's books don't? And Reinfeld was a much stronger player. He wrote many more books, but Chernev's books are much more successful. And it occurred to me that the reason is that he was just very good at selecting subject matter. he came up with, great ideas. And one of them was 1,000 best short games of chess. And I think short games are like the ideal teaching instrument. So I was trying, how could I improve on the Chernev idea? And what I came up with was the format that you see in the 365, which is, one game per page, with one lesson to explain in that page, with quiz questions for the reader to solve, and some supplemental games with the same opening or the same theme. And the idea is that you can do this today, you'll do another one tomorrow, and at the end of the day, each day, you can actually feel like you learned something. And that's kind of a magical experience, because it's really hard to feel that you've learned something in a classroom that you can use. You could take a college class, and today you're going to learn all about masculine, feminine nouns in Spanish, but until you apply it, it's just book learning. But in chess, you can actually apply what you learn today, tomorrow, in your next game. So that's the type of thing that I was aiming for in 365.
Yeah, and it is a great format. I mean, the games are very compact. I mean, less than 20 moves. And as someone who does do a lot of chess teaching, as you mentioned, we're always looking for quick games that we can show. And these are quick games, and some of them are famous, but a lot of them are more obscure. I mean, like more senior master rather than grandmaster level players, or people from the U.S. circuit. So they're not games that you've just automatically come across. So I definitely recommend it to listeners. Getting back to Chernev for a second, I think it was in your Chess to Enjoy column that I learned that I hadn't known that he wasn't such a strong player. I mean, with a name like Chernev, I just automatically assume he's a grandmaster. So, but he was only an expert level player. Is that what you wrote?
That was my understanding. I got a very nice note from I guess his granddaughter just recently, saying that she and Chernev's son, I think Melvin, who worked at Chess Review at one time, and they both enjoyed that. But no, that's true. He wasn't a very strong player, but he was very avid. He was very interested in collecting the oddities about chess. He was basically the Robert J. Ripley of believe it or not type information, and he branched out from that into other aspects of chess. I think the first book he wrote was with Fred Reinfeldt. It was a collaboration. They created their own publishing company called Black Knight Press, and from there on, Chernev came up with these wonderful ideas like the most instructive games of chess ever played, and of course logical chess, move by move, which is a classic. He came up with formats that everyone has been imitating ever since.
Yeah, they are very original and stand the test of time. I mean, I still find myself recommending those books to newer players and using them if I'm teaching newer players. So getting to your other latest project, your multibiography. So how did you decide on these four players, on Tal, Petrosian, Spassky, and Korchnoi?
Well, the idea started when I had finished the book on Botvinga a few years ago, and Robbie Franklin of McFarland said, well, why don't you do another one, do Smyslov or something like that. And I thought about maybe I should be a little more expansive on this subject. How about a parallel lives type thing, a chess Plutarch thing, where I could do Smyslov and Paul Keres and Sammy Reshevsky, because they were all contemporaries. But then when I thought about it, a book like that, the first third of the book is going to be about Reshevsky as a kid and a prodigy, and Smyslov doesn't even figure into it until Reshevsky's already in his 20s. Or maybe 30s, and this, Keres is playing postal chess when Reshevsky's already world famous. So I sort of put that aside, but then I came up with another idea. How about for people who were contemporaries? Petrosian, I guess, was born in 1929, and Tal and Spassky around the beginning of 1937. So they lived the the same lives. And also, these guys had such incredible life experiences that world-class players simply don't have today.
Yeah.
For example, Korchnoi lived through the blockade of Leningrad during the war, and when he was, I guess, around 11, basically everybody in his family died of starvation. He almost died of starvation himself, and he only survived because his mother-in-law, stepmother actually, his stepmother worked in a candy factory, and that kept him alive. But at one point, his grandmother died, and she needed to be buried. So Korchnoi, again, he's like 11 years old, and his friend take Korchnoi's winter sled, his boyhood sled. They lift the body of his grandmother onto the sled, and they drag it through the frozen streets of Leningrad a mile across the Never River, so that they can be buried. Somehow, I don't visualize players from the Sinkfield Cup doing that type of stuff.
Right.
Or Tal. Tal. Tal was a world-class player. He's one of the 5 best players in the world when he was addicted to opioids. That's just astonishing to me. He was hooked on something called pantopone. And his wife, Sally, wrote in her memoir about how Mikhail Botvinnik wrote her and said, look, we can get Tal into a clinic in Moscow to get him straightened out. And this is very strange because Botvinnik was not that that chummy with anybody. And Sally showed the letter to Tal, and Tal being Tal, he joked about it. He said, "I see you want to trade husbands. You want to. Is it really smart to exchange one ex-world champion for another ex-world champion?" Again, these people were just amazing personalities, and very little is known about them, about their private lives. And of course, there are a lot of games here. And when I looked over the games, I didn't realize how many of Petrosian's early games he didn't understand how to sacrifice the exchange. Today he's famous for the exchange sacrifice, but that's at the Central Chess Club in Moscow. There used to be in one of the men's room lavatories, there was a graffiti on the wall that said, "This is where Petrosian thought up the exchange sacrifice." That's their Russian
funny.
humor.
Right. So, yeah, it is true that especially when it comes to the personal lives, a lot of people don't know all of these details. So how do you uncover them from your perch in New York? How are you able to come to uncover all these stories, as well as new games, games new to us from the players, and stuff like that? Like, what are your research methods?
Well, in a lot of cases, I'm getting this from articles that are written in Russian magazines, in some cases going back to Soviet era, but mainly since 2000. And there's a lot of good stuff on the Internet. There's some wonderful Russian language chess sites like Chess Pro and Chess News RU, and another one called E3, E5, that people who don't know Russian, and they don't know how to use the Google Translator or the automatic translation button, wouldn't know about. And this is the type of stuff that I didn't have access to. I wanted to write this book basically 20 years ago, but I wrote the book on Soviet chess instead because the material was more available. Again, something like the stories about Tal, a lot of them came from his wife, which is surprising because if you know that wonderful book that Tal wrote, The Life and Games of Mikhail Tal, at one point he mentions how he was playing this decisive game in the first Botvinnik match, where he has a bishop out on g5, Botvinnik attacks it. Tal defends the bishop with his pawn, which was very controversial at the time, and because it seemed anti-positional and all that. In his notes in Tal's book, Tal says, well, I could have protected the bishop with my queen, but then we'd trade queens, we'd have a draw, and the big problem for me was whether or not I would get tickets to the theater for my wife and me that night. And it's a typical flip remark by Tal, but it was the only time in that book that he mentioned his wife. And they had this incredible love story, and it's just, they, according to their friends like Mark Taimanov, they would fight, break up, reconcile, fight again. They had I'll give you one little anecdote here. At one time, during, when Tal is ex-world champion, but he's trying to make a comeback, it's 1964, and he was then spending a lot of time in Moscow with one of his girlfriends, who happened to be a movie actress. She also happened to be a KGB agent.
Weren't they all?
She had seduced some French ambassador in one of these classic honey traps. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Tal may or may not have known that. But the Communist Party did, and they got very upset about Tal's dalliances, and he was called before the Central Committee. Normally, the problems with Tal and other chess players were handled in the government agencies like the Soviet Chess Federation, or above that in the food chain was the Sports Ministry. It was called the Sports Committee. But in this case, it was the Central Committee, which is a big deal. And they said, Comrade Tal, you are a Soviet citizen. You are famous. Even in the West, they're talking about your girlfriend, and you have a choice. You can either dump your girlfriend and reconcile with your wife, or, not as quite as good is divorce your wife and marry your girlfriend. And Tal said, just, go away. I'm not going to do that. You have no right to tell me to do this. So the Central Committee declared him, or actually it was another agency, declared him, I'm going to use a Russian term called nevyezdny, and basically it means you can't leave the country, which to a Soviet chess player was almost a death sentence because traveling abroad was so important. And the way that he got out of that, according to his wife Sally, was due to his mother, Ida. Ida Tal came up with what Sally called not just a brilliant move, but a brilliant combination. And here's how it went. The first move, she advised Tal and Sally to go to the government office and register their divorce. The second move is make sure it gets picked up in the Latvian newspapers and is reported to the Central Committee. Third move, he is no longer nevyezdny. He goes to Amsterdam to play in the interzonal that he would have been barred from doing if he was still limited to the Soviet Union. He wins the interzonal in a tie for three-way tie. And the fourth move, he goes back to Latvia, and he and Sally tear up their divorce agreement. And they they continue having their strange relationship. And again, that comes from Sally's book, which is I can't imagine why it's not been translated. But there are many good sources out there for Soviet chess history and post-Soviet Soviet era times. So that's basically my source material there. And some of the old books that were printed in the old days. But, remember, Petrosian never wrote just about anything about himself except for some articles. Spassky was trained as a journalist. That was his cop-out. That way he didn't have to have a real profession. He claimed he was a journalist. And, of course, he keeps saying that, when I die, my memoirs will come out. But there doesn't seem to be any evidence that he's written it. And Korchnoi, he wrote a couple of different memoirs, but quite a bit of what he wrote was misleading. And as I mentioned, Dahl leaves out an awful lot. Autobiography is the art of omission, I think. So you really need to get your information from some other source.
Wow. Well, I can't wait to read it. So you mentioned in terms of reading Russian writing that these days you can use Google Translate or other translating mechanisms, but I know that you also speak some Russian. So how good is your Russian?
It's terrible. I can order borscht in a restaurant, and I still remember some poems that I learned in the 11th grade. I was finishing up in high school, and I didn't want to take another year of Spanish, which I've of course forgotten as well. So I took some Russian. That was probably the smartest decision I ever made in high school, and my wife, actually, Marcy, speaks much better. She's more of a conversationalist than I am, and I basically, read a lot, and every day I check out the Russian language, the websites, including their, the Levada Center, which is their public opinion polling, the best one in Russia, and some of the other good sources. That's actually one of the best decisions I ever made was picking up something in Russian. We were in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and I had dinner with an old high school friend, and I asked him what he was a retired scientist now, and he has all sorts of degrees, including a doctorate. And I asked him what was the most important classroom experience you ever had. What was the best class you ever had? And he said it was in junior high school when he learned typing. Because that's something he's used in his entire life.
Right.
You really make important decisions and learn things early on in your life that you can benefit from, 50 years later.
And were you one of the many chess players that studied Russian explicitly because of the chess connection?
Well, not just explicit. It was something I thought might be useful. Who knows what the next language that will be useful. I thought, there'd be some opportunities. Maybe I didn't know I was going to go into journalism at that time. I thought, I might end up in the Foreign Service, and who knows? If I had to do it over again, I probably would have studied Mandarin or Arabic, maybe. At the time, it seemed like a good decision, and it sort of worked its way out.
And do you find are there any other languages you've had to wade your way through in the course of your writing?
No, I at one time I was thinking about doing a book about Richard Reti, and I tried to get through a book on learning Czechoslovakian or Czech, and that's sort of embarrassing because my roots are in Slovakia, actually near the Polish border. And I've made several attempts at trying to learn a bit of German, and that's all been a dismal failure. So it's sort of like my experience when I was young and I tried to learn the endgame, and every year I would take out Basic Chess Endings by Reuben Fine, and I would say to myself, okay, this time I'm going to get past move page 30. And never did. By the time I was at page 25, I'd just give up and close it, and next year I'll try again.
That's why you've written a book of miniature games.
Yes, yeah. My attention span sometimes is about as what is very common today. It's very short. I mean, I think that's the reason why we have world championship matches that last only 12 games and are over in 2 weeks, instead of the old days when they were 24 game matches and they lasted 2 months. The Fischer boom would not have happened if there was a 12-game match that was over in 2 weeks. It was only because Fischer and Spassky were on the front pages every day, essentially throughout July and August of 1972. And I think the public did have the attention span for that. I think people who organize chess events got it wrong now when they want only these speed events and they only want these short tournaments, and because they think that, well, anything longer than the Olympic Games is something that the public can't deal with, and I think the public does like to follow stuff that lasts quite a bit longer.
Yeah, it's not clear. The chess public, I think, has an insatiable appetite, but getting back to sort of what we were talking about with the books that you publish, it's the elusive crossover crowd that you never know what they want, and that's the group that people are making conjectures about, whether they're right or not.
Yeah. Nobody knows what the next phase is going to be. I remember that in the musical Chess, there's something called the Merchandiser's Song, which has actually been omitted in the later versions. I think even the Broadway version of the Chess. But in the Merchandiser's Song, the line something like, "We've done our market research, and the data shows that this game of chess will be around a month or so." And it goes on to say, it's sort of like, Rubik's Cube. The public loved it, and then they moved on, and that's what the merchandisers will do.
Yeah, which thankfully they've been proven wrong. So,
yeah.
So you mentioned the Fischer and Spassky match, of course, which all our listeners know all about. But I couldn't. In my research, it suggested that your New York Post column started in 1972. Is that correct?
That's right. There's an editor who was a chess fan, and I'd been writing daily reports about the match. And when it was over, one of the editors said, "Look, why don't you try writing a chess column and see how that works out. It'll only be appearing once a week, and the top editor want to make sure that there'll be no foreign trips. You don't have an expense account." He was making sure that there wasn't going to cost them any money. Except for I took like one morning off each week to write a column, and let's see, another couple of weeks. This will be starting my 47th year in doing that column.
That's amazing.
And in January, I think I'll start my 40th year in chess life.
Okay, so the internet has it right. 79 for your Chess to Enjoy column in Chess Life, and 72 for the New York Post. That's just incredible.
I'm not Leonard Barden, though. Leonard Barden is still going strong in Britain, and he's been writing his columns for quite a bit longer than me, and he does a top-notch job.
Yeah, he would be. It's quite I consider it a great feather in my cap to have you as a guest, and he would be another one that I would love to have. So, Leonard, if you're listening, send me an email. Were there moments in writing this column for the New York Post where you thought it wouldn't survive?
Oh, yeah, periodically there have been times when I didn't think it would last. It used to be appearing, what the expression was run of the paper, ROP, meaning whenever there was a space in the back of the paper, they would find some room for it. And then they decided that wasn't going to work. And I thought, well, that's, okay, that's the end. But then they decided to put it into I think it was on a cartoon page, a comic strip page. And it shrank a bit in that, but at least it had a regular spot. And they continued that until they got rid of the comics page, and then they found another place. And fortunately, it survived all these years. I think that's the reason why one of the reasons why the New York Times column died is because they simply didn't find a good spot for it. It was competing, for space with real news, and if you have a choice between, doing a story about an Ebola breakout in Africa or running a chess column, I don't think there's much of a choice if you're an editor.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that it has survived. I tried to track some down online, and I didn't have much luck. Do you know if one were to want to go through your back catalog for the New York Post? Do you know is it behind a paywall, or does one have to go to the library, or how could one?
No, I don't. You have to go to the library, I guess, because it's not run online.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, and the funny thing about a newspaper is that unlike a bridge column, a chess column is something that should appeal to advertisers, and the reason is that you can read a bridge column and you can play over the play of the hand just by crossing out the cards. If you're a bridge player, and I'm a very bad bridge player.
Likewise, yeah.
But you can and then you can throw away the newspaper. You don't need it anymore. But a chess column has to go home because you're not going to play over the game in your head. So that's very valuable because a newspaper that people take home has a multiplier effect. When they will say, okay, our circulation is 1 million, but our readership is 2.5 million, meaning that you take this paper home and the husband reads it and the wife reads it and maybe the kid reads it also. So I think that I'm really surprised that chess columns have had such a bad luck over the years, but mine is fortunately still going strong.
Yeah, that's great. Although now, these days, we are sort of in the golden age of chess coverage. Most of it has migrated online, but there's still something about a column in a newspaper that it has the ability to reach people that the internet doesn't necessarily. Yeah,
there are a lot of good sites on the internet, and I start each day after my morning cup of coffee, and watching the news on TV, and then I turn on the machine and I go through various sites, including some Russian sites, and usually that gives me a pretty good idea of where things stand. I'm just sorry that a lot of sites aren't updated as often as they could be, and you miss out on a lot of stuff. And of course, websites die left and right. It's really amazing. There used to be a wonderful site called KasparovChess.com, and just didn't last. And that succeeded another site that Garry Kasparov had called Club Kasparov. And that one didn't last. So you can't find these anymore online because they disappeared. And that's the trouble. A lot of information that used to exist is gone, and we lose sources of information every day, and that's really a tragedy.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, like you mentioned with online, if you didn't preserve it, you may not see it again. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you're reading about chess, among other things, as part of your daily routine. Do you follow, like as we record, the Sinkfield Cup ended a couple days ago. Do you follow events like that closely?
The Sinkfield Cup? Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, I switch from site to site. I watch the games unfold on Chess Bomb and also Chess Dom. To see what the computers are telling me, and sometimes I look at Chess 24 to get their take on it. I always find it amusing sometimes when somebody will be up 2 pawns, but it's in a bishop is of opposite color endgame, and the computer says it's like a easily won game, and
right.
I know it's going to be a draw. Unfortunately, watching chess online these days is getting sort of boring because, the Berlin defense is sort of killing pawn to e4, and the Berlin defense is forcing players to play bishop to c4 on the third move. So they're playing openings now that were in fashion 120 years ago, and without any new ideas being added. And everybody's equal after 20 moves. It's really hard to get excited about this. Again, if you had in the old days when their World Championship matches lasted 24 games, players took more risk because they knew if I lose today, okay, I might come back tomorrow. And like Vasily Smyslov won one of his greatest games against Botvinnik a day after he had gotten crushed by Botvinnik. The games of the Petrosian Spassky matches towards the end, they were great like that because Spassky would smash Petrosian in 25 moves. And the next day, next game, Petrosian would come back, and he'd won a strategic masterpiece. Those were, and of course, the Kasparov-Karpov matches, the same story. Today, the danger of losing one game in a match of 12 is disastrous. So the players are just super cautious, frankly, if I actually think that the fact that it's going to be a 12-game match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana is in Caruana's favor. If it had been a longer match, well, he has no real match experience, Caruana, and Carlsen is already a veteran of match play. But in a short match, I think Caruana has very good chances of winning.
Yeah, it seems like Caruana is he's really hitting his peak just at the right moment for this match, so it'll be interesting. Now, I know that you have lived through and rooted on many world championships, so have you been more excited for some than others, or as a chess fan, do you just get sort of amped up for all of them?
No, there's some that I look forward to certainly more than others. The Karpov-Kasparov matches, I think, were the best that I can recall, at least part of them. Then again, I thought the Fischer-Spassky rematch in 1992 was a very good match. The quality of the games was fairly high, considering these guys were, over the hill. It's one of the things about the rating system is that it's so inflated that you find that players are supposedly reach their peak when they're 40, which is ridiculous. I mean, when was Karpov at his peak? When he was 24 and he became world champion, or during the years after that, when he was 34, when he lost the world championship? No, the rating system says he was at his peak when he was 44. Same thing with Galakamsky. He was supposedly at his peak, a few years ago, rather than when he played a world championship match. But in the case of Spassky and Fischer, I think they did play, exceptionally good chess at a very late stage. Unfortunately, Fischer, was crazy.
Yeah, quite unfortunately. Garry Kasparov famously sort of lampooned the playing level at that match. Do you think he had ulterior motives when he said that, or is it just a difference of opinion?
Well, it's kind of funny. Remember the context there. Fischer and Spassky rematch was 92. Kasparov was due to play a world championship match in 93. And it looked like Fischer was the Fischer match was for $5 million, which was a ridiculous amount of money. The guy who put up the money was a crook. But Fischer got paid off. Spassky got paid off. They did very well. And then it looked like in 93, there were Kasparov and his opponent, who turned out to be Nigel Short, would be playing for much less. And Spassky would get more for losing to Fischer than Kasparov would for winning that match. So I think he was he was looking ahead at that time and thinking that this is something unfair about this. And then of course there was a big the great split in the chess world when Kasparov and Short sort of hijacked the World Championship match and played it outside of FIDE, and it took us quite a while to repair that damage. It wasn't until 2006 there was a reunification match.
I mean, FIDE was not they were not a beacon of propriety in terms of how they ran their organization. But yeah, when you run through the list of historical world champions, and when people debate whether Caruana is the first American to play for the world championship since Fischer, or if Galakamsky is, like stuff like that, is not really not a pleasant debate to have one way or the other. It would be better if these things were just clear cut.
Yeah, if you're looking for a silly match, I think the Kramnik-Glikko match, which I think of as the Cigar World Championship because it was sponsored by a cigar company. That was one of the worst. But again, matches in which there's only one or two victories, and the entire match are just boring. So that's where we stand.
So, reading between the lines, you're looking forward to this upcoming match, but it's not. Doesn't rival Kasparov-Karpov in terms of your anticipation?
No, again, because it's going to be such a short match. I have great faith in the seconds for both of these. They have terrific teams of trainers. Rustam Kazimchimov, who is the chief trainer for Caruana. He's a kingmaker. He made Vichy Anand world champion. And then he went on and he started training Sergei Karyakin. So this guy has the winning touch. And he might be able to, transfer that to Caruana. And remind everybody, Kazimchanov won the FIDE World Championship in one of those knockout tournaments many, many years ago. The one that was in Tripoli, as I recall, infamously in Tripoli.
Yeah, very strong player in his own right. And Carlsen, I don't know if he has any a trainer per se as strong, but his team seemed to do right by him in the most recent World Championship against Karyakin. So, yeah,
it's not just you have to have people around you that you can trust and that you can talk to. One of the stories that I uncovered I read about when I was doing this book on Petrosian, Spassky and Korchnoi, was about Rona Petrosian, who was, and the thing is, Petrosian was henpecked. I mean, he let his wife boss him around. And there was one point in the Botvinnik match when Petrosian was leading. He was winning the match, but he was so exhausted. And one day he just said, "I'm not going to the match." And she just blew up at him. And Rona Petrosian was about 5 foot, maybe 5 foot. But she was like bullying him and saying, "You donkey, you lazy bones, you're going to that match if I have to drag you." And she basically did drag him to the match. And when the two of them were telling this story to a friend of theirs, who's a famous musician who wrote his memoirs, and he recalled this. After Rona was detailing how she had basically forced him to become world champion, Petrosian felt embarrassed, and he said, "Rona, don't give away the company secrets."
That's very funny. Yeah, that's great. So, in preparing for this interview, I was lucky enough to get a little bit of help. Obviously, I've read some of your books. I would love to read your whole catalog, but we've been planning this for about a week, so I couldn't do it in a week. But I did manage to track down a couple old interviews, so I want to thank Fred Wilson, who put us in touch, for sending me one of his old interviews with you, and John Hartman of Chess Life for helping me track down an old interview of yours with John Watson and for the Internet Chess Club. And one thing you said in your interview, I think, with Fred, was that your favorite book of all those that you wrote was the one about Soviet chess. So I wanted to update that and see if that's still the case.
Well, I think it probably was until I think this new book, Tal Petrosian, Spassky, Korchnoi, is the one I currently feel is my favorite. But I love all of my children.
Of course, yes. Yes, so no need to disparage any of them.
Yeah, it would be terrible if I had to say, okay, this is the best I can do, and never. I very rarely look at my old Chess Life articles. Maybe once, a year when the annual. I got a copy of the annual that collects all of the issues of Chess Life. And I'll go through and look at there. But it's like, I hated reading my newspaper articles, non-chess newspaper articles. It takes a while before you can get used to reading your own writing. Probably the best the best thing I ever did for the Post when I was a reporter. One day they called me in. It was a Sunday morning. I remember that because it was my day off, and Ronald Reagan had died the previous day, and I had done an obituary in advance for Reagan 10 years before. Newspapers prepare obituaries many years in advance. And they ran it that day, but they said they wanted to do a big spread, about 10, 12 pages with lots of photos. So we want you to, expand on what you did. So I went in to the office and I said, okay, how many words do you need? They said, about 5,000.
Wow.
And I look up at the clock and it's 1:30 and deadline is in like 5 hours. And I made the deadline easily. One of my strengths has always been that I'm a fast writer, and that's still that piece that I wrote. Was actually the best job working under deadline that I've ever done. And I've done a lot of chess columns under deadline to pressure too, but that's the one that I enjoy the most.
It's that time management experience from competitive chess coming in handy.
Yeah, well, actually, I think there are a lot of things that come in handy. I always like the idea that giving simultaneous exhibitions where you would go from board to board helped me in other ways, helped me in journalism, because one of the things you do in a simul is you immediately have to reset your mind when you get to the next board and rethink what was I doing last time I was standing in front of this board, and it'll come back to you. And then you have to switch off that part of your brain when you move on to the next board. And I did that a lot when I was working as a rewrite man at the Post, because I'd be working on a story about politics, but I'm also working on a couple of other stories, and I'd have to take a call from one of our reporters at police headquarters, and I take his notes, and then I put that aside, and then I go on to something else, and I have to do some captions for some photos that just came in. It's that ability to switch off your thinking from here to there, and then be able to reset and get back into where you were, when you last looked at the stuff. That when I looked at that last time, I was on my computer screen. That's what I was thinking, and now I can rethink it.
That's interesting, because chess also, people make the opposite argument where, if you're playing classical chess, you're just focused on one thing. So it can be, if you're just playing classical chess, it can be harder to switch, although I can see how simuls would help you.
Oh, sure. And also, when you play a tournament game, you have ability to concentrate so much that you block out a lot of everything that's happening. I remember one time playing in a tournament in Midtown Manhattan, and after the game was over, Marcy said, how could you think with all the fire alarms? And I said, what fire alarms? And there was a fire truck outside where we were playing, and it was making an enormous amount of noise, but I didn't hear it until she mentioned it.
Right.
I had just completely screened it out.
Yeah. There's many chess players with stories like that. It is an incredible thing, the mind's ability to block out distractions. So speaking of your playing days, so what do you consider your highlights, whether they be like from an actual performance level or just in terms of memories to cherish?
That's a hard one. I guess my favorite games were ones that I played in the early 1970s. Quite some. Despite what you may have seen, on the internet and elsewhere, I was still playing chess up until I think 2002. But my best games, I really enjoyed playing in the student Olympiads, and against players who that went on to become very strong. Vladimir Tokmakov of the Soviet Union, and Gyula Saks of Hungary, and Vitaly Sashkovsky of the Soviet Union. Those are Robert Hubner, I got crushed by in one of those. I really enjoyed those things, and we actually did win a world championship for the United States in 1970. Fortunately, that was because the Soviet bloc countries were boycotting the tournament because it was held in Israel, and this was 3 years after the Six-Day War. But it was a real world championship, and we deserved the title. We had a great team, and Ken Rogoff was the first board on that team, and I was second, and I think I scored something like 8 wins and 1 draw, and that was it. So those are my fondest memories.
So you mentioned, the Student Olympiad, was that what we would consider comparable to like the World Junior now? I'm not familiar. I'm familiar with the Olympiad, but not the Student Olympiad.
Oh, these were team tournaments, and I think you had to be under the age of 26 to qualify, and you didn't actually have to be a student anywhere. But they were held annually beginning in 1954, I believe, and continued into the 80s. But eventually they died out, I think in part because the players felt that they were professionals, and they expected to be paid a lot of money to play for their country. There was one year, 1968, where the members of the U.S. team had to pay their own way to get to the tournament in a place called Ypres, Austria, which actually I cruised past just recently. Huh. But they were held on a regular basis, and it was very important for the Soviets to win these. And as I go into in this book coming out in a couple of months, they absolutely were under orders, you must win. Mm-hmm. And Mark Taimanov described this one time when he was called in and said, you have to play in this tournament, you have to win it. And he said, how important is it? And he was told, well, the orders come from Stalin himself.
Wow!
And he got them. So they ended up, and actually, this was one of the things, the tournaments that was when it was sort of a student individual tournament, and the two players that they sent to this tournament were both world-class players, and they were playing guys. Their opponents in that tournament were basically 1900 players. So David Bronstein, who was number 2 player in the world at the time, is outrating his opponent by 600 points because they were just under absolute instructions. You must bring back first prize. I'm sorry to see those tournaments died out, but it's the professionalization that's taken over chess these days.
Yeah, and back in those days, it seemed like it was much more common for players to just people who became grandmasters. It might happen in their around the age of 30 or even 35. It was something that you really had to work toward. So whether they were actually peaking in chess strength at that age, I'm not sure, but it was certainly a lot harder to get the titles and climb the ratings. So, and something like under age 26 wouldn't have sounded as silly as it does now when we have so many teenagers making grandmasters compared to the old days.
Yeah, it's amazing. I find it astonishing that we have a world championship for some of the under 10 age group, and it's you can look at the USCF website and you can find the top players in every boys and girls in each age group, and you see the ratings on them, and they're just amazing that these kids are that strong at that early age.
Yeah, it's incredible, and it seems like the timetable just continues to get pushed forward.
I think one of the things that hasn't really gotten out to the general public is the way that Asian Americans are taking over U.S. chess. Because when you look at those ratings, those rating lists on the USCF, these kids with Chinese, Indian, Vietnamese surnames absolutely dominate in the under 12, under 13, under 9 categories, and that's going to be the case for probably the near future. I mean, I can imagine we're going to have an all-Asian U.S. Olympic team in 20 years. It's like the 1930s when The U.S. team would be composed of Reshevsky, Arthur Dake, who was actually Dukowski. He was Polish also. I think Ruben Fine's origins were Polish, so it seemed like the Polish-American team won the world championship, not in those Olympiads, not the U.S. team. Well, it's changing again. We went through a period when the offspring of Europeans dominated U.S. chess, and then we went through the Soviet period when so many Soviet emigres came to the United States, and now we're seeing another change.
Yeah, it is interesting. As a scholastic teacher, I see it just in terms of the interest level, the demographics of like the group classes and after-school programs that I teach are heavily, as you say, Chinese American and Indian American.
Yeah, because they have the excellent educational skills, and they have that interest, and the discipline that seems to be lacking in so many other and in so many other people in our country. It's instead of becoming doctors and lawyers and musicians, they'll also be chess players.
Yeah, and on the global stage, China and India are also no slouches.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if India is the top chess nation by the year 2030. It wouldn't be surprising.
Yeah, I agree. And so another event that we have coming up, obviously the World Championship is most anticipated but the Olympiad is also coming up. Did you ever play in the Olympiad? And do you have, is it an event that you track closely?
Oh, absolutely, because I always like the Olympiad because in the first rounds you get these mismatches and they have upsets. The most likely time to see an upset is going to be in the first round of an Olympiad when you have a 300-point mismatch between two players. And it does become interesting as things unfold. The U.S., of course, is going to be the favorites. We have it's basically the St. Louis Chess Club taking on the rest of the world,
right?
And that's a great tribute to what Rex and Gene have been able to do in St. Louis. I hope the United States wins. What happens in the FIDE election for the new president, I have no idea. That's going to be an interesting thing, the way that shakes out.
Yeah, that's tough to predict. So Mr. Soltis, I just have one or two more topics if you're up for it.
Sure, shoot.
Okay, great. So one is if you have any, I know that you've played Bobby Fischer and you knew him a little bit. So if you have any stories that come to mind or other chess legends, I'm sure you've met your share over the years, but our listeners love to hear stories that they might not have come across anywhere else.
Well, let me think. Fischer, well, I'll tell you, one of my brushes with Fischer, I played in the New York State Open on Labor Day, the Labor Day weekend of 1963. And in the last round, I ended up being paired with Jimmy Sherwin, and James T. Sherwin was a perennial U.S. championship competitor. And last round, and I gave him a good game. It was a very interesting opening, which was topical at that time. But we were playing at the IBM Country Club, and they had to shut down the premises. And also, the tournament director forgot to bring a checkbook to the final round, so we had to get into cars and go to his home so we could get our prize money.
Wow.
Anyway, so I never looked at the game with Jimmy afterwards, and I had to get back home to New York. But the following day, there was some event at the Marshall Chess Club, so I walk in, and Sherwin says, "You want to look at the game?" And he outrated me by 500 points. So I'm sort of astonished right there. So we go to the back room and at this table, and it's actually the table known as the Capablanca table because Capablanca had played there. And in fact, Fischer would later play on that table when he was playing by cable with the tournament in Havana when he couldn't get a visa from the State Department. But anyway, we're looking at the game, and Fischer walks in, and he says, and he just takes the the seat in front of us. So I'm looking at Sherwin, Sherwin's looking at me, and Fischer is to my right and to Sherwin's left. And he starts analyzing the game with us.
So how was he already world champion, or where was he in his trajectory?
This is 63, so he's I think he was about to start one of his retirements. This is before he won the U.S. championship, whatever it was, 12-0 or 13-0. But he was still thinking of himself as world champion, and he was prepared in all sorts of openings. But he was analyzing with us, and Sherwin made the point that he had spent, I think, 30 hours preparing this particular opening. And I guess he sort of regretted that he had to use up his analysis against me. But after every couple of moves, Fischer would say, "Okay, what do you do on this?" And suggesting an alternative to what I played. And Sherwin would try to find an answer, and Fischer would demolish it, and just flick his fingers very quickly, and this doesn't work, and then. We tried to find another way that could strengthen Black's play in that game, and Fischer was that's ridiculous. And at the end of it, he said something like, "Yeah, and you spent 30 hours on this?"
That's very funny. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I tried to look up online. I had the impression that you'd played him, but the only thing I could find was a blitz game.
Yes, that's actually a strange thing. The Manhattan Chess Club used to move every couple of years because, unlike the Marshall, they didn't own their residence. Yeah. And since they were the Manhattan Chess Club, they had to stay in Manhattan, which is a bad thing to do in terms of the real estate market. So in the summer of 1971, they were opening their new headquarters, on I guess it was East 55th Street, and this was, I think, in between when Fischer beat Larson 6-0 and when he beat Taimanov 6-0, or it might have been after both of those matches. So Fischer was, on a roll, and he was invited to be the star of a blitz tournament. It was a very impressive blitz tournament at the Manhattan Double Rounds. I guess 12 players, something like that. And in the first round, I was paired with Fischer, just as the way it worked out there, and I had white. And the deal that they made with the photographer from the New York Times was that he could take photos, for that game, and that was it. Otherwise, he couldn't. So the Times ran this wonderful photo the following day of me playing Fischer, and I'm about to move, and Fischer's responding, and in the background, the spectators who are watching, they're like, people on top of people, and in the front row, you can see there was Hans Kmock, who was, the guy who ran the U.S. championship every year. He was the best annotator in the United States. He was watching this, and Bert Hochberg and his wife were there. Bert was going to become the editor of Chess Life, rather. And who else was in? There were a whole series of famous people in the New York chess scene at that time. And that's the game. And of course, I was worse out of the opening against Fischer, and then he hung his queen. And so I'm winning Fischer's queen for a rook, and he has some pawns, and he starts pushing them. And there are no photographs of that part, but eventually I was so short on time, I started making illegal moves, which is sort of embarrassing to do against Bobby Fischer. And I eventually lost. And then I knew I was going to lose, even after I won his queen. It's just like a sense of his power was radiating across the board. And then the next game, he just crushed me, and again, it was an opening that was ahead of its time. Some variation Sicilian, but after that, I perked up, and I eventually finished second in the tournament to Fischer, and that could be, I think, my biggest achievement in chess. Funny thing, when I retired, the New York Post gave me a front page. This is something that is a tradition. They sort of a mock front page. It looks just like a regular front page, and it's a plaque, but it has a photo of me playing Fischer. But it's not the one that appeared in the Times. They bought another photo from the Times that was never used in the newspaper, and it's Fischer and I are joking about the game after it was played, and that's one of my favorite mementos from chess.
Yeah, I should think so. That's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing it. Okay, and last but not least, a chess author of your stature. We have a regular feature on this podcast where we ask them for book recommendations. So obviously, they should run out and buy. Our listeners should run out and buy your books. But in addition to that, do you have a favorite author or books that you recommend to people?
No, I don't think there's nothing in particular that I mean, some of the Reinfeldt books I really enjoyed. My favorite book when I was starting out was Reinfeldt's book on Nimzowitsch. It was called Hypermodern Chess. That was one of my favorites. Again, anything by Chernov is a winner. Most particularly the most instructive games of chess ever played. That you can't go wrong with that. Let me think. The book that the best book on chess history that I know of. Again, not including my own, but is the book that two English reporters did on the Fischer-Spassky match a few years ago. The name of the book escapes me, but it is really a top-notch job, and because they actually did, they interviewed all sorts of people, and that's what real research is. People think the chess historians who collect footnotes are doing the ultimate job, but this is a case where they actually got to sources, and they spoke to Henry Kissinger about his phone call to Fischer, and they spoke to all of the Soviet people involved in it, and of course Spassky. That was a really good book. But let me think. Nothing else occurs to me. I'm trying to get rid of some of my my chess books simply because I have too many in my house.
How many do you think you have? Any guesses?
Well over 1,000.
Wow.
And I'm trying to get rid of all of my old magazines as well. Now I've got. I don't need Chess Review annuals because everything's online anyway. In fact, I sold a lot of my books just recently to Fred Wilson. So
he should have marketed them as once owned by Andy Soltis.
Yeah, I don't think that's...
Okay, well, Andy, this has been an incredible honor, and it has not disappointed. It was I was looking forward to it, and it was great to hear your perspective, and thanks for sharing all these stories. I'm sure listeners will love it.
Oh, thanks, Ben, because I enjoyed being here. So if you want to call me back some other day, then we can do it again. That would be awesome. So yeah, that would be great, and we look forward to I mean, we've got your current books, but we also look forward to the next one. It sounds incredible. So we'll be checking for it. I believe Amazon says like January 2nd, 2019 or something. Something like that. Yeah. Okay. I know these things can get moved anyway, but in that area. That's right. Okay, well, thank you so much, Andy. This has been great. And thank you. Thanks for listening to Perpetual Chess. If you like the show, shout it from the hilltops. Tell your friends. Write positive reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform. If you don't like the show, just keep it to yourself. I want to give special thanks to Geert Vandervelt for making the intro music. And of course, I have to thank my Patreon and PayPal Perpetual partners, without whom the show would not be possible. They are Adam Ralph, Adam Vrancoulge, Adrian Gutierrez, Andres Krizdwa, Alex Pejas, Brian Mullis, Carl Labans, Chris Wainscott, Chad Hilton, Christopher Wood, Coach J's Chess Academy, Chris Flanagan. I am Christoph Zulicki, Dan O'Hanlon, Daniel Ginsberg, Daniel Naylor, Daniel Schaefer. I am elect Donnie Ariel, Frank Tortoris, Gary Andrews, Greg Shahadi, Harish Srinivasan, GM Jacob Agard, James Bonastia, Jennifer Valens, Jeffrey Martello, John Fernandez, John Hartman, John Jernigan, Jen Shahadi,
Jens Green, Jerry Wells, John Thompson, Johnny McMenamin, WGM Katerina Nemkova, Kelly Palmer, Krishna Gopalakrishnan, Laura Belyavsky, Lorraine Dore, Matthew Passy, the producer of Perpetual Chess, Macaulay Peterson, Matthew Tedesco, Nathan Webster, GM Pascal Charbonneau, Paul Sweeney, Paulo Santana, Peter Lux, Peter Merrifield, Randall Temple, Ricky Grahova, Rob Lazorchek, Robert Steiner, WGM Tatyev Abrahamian, Thomas Stanix, Thomas Tachenko, Tim Seymour, Timothy Ha, Todd Bryant, Tony Rotella, Victor Vrankulj, FM Zhao Cheng, and Zhivko Stoyanov. Thanks again, everyone. I will be back soon with another interview.